賽馬會藝壇新勢力喺嘉道理農場暨植物園策劃咗一個名為《生命如此艱難，何必搞得這麼簡單》嘅展覽。藝術家鄭波藉著創作嚟思考人類同埋自然之間嘅關係，回應當下所面對嘅生活處境。
到而家呢個時代，越嚟越多人去開始諗，係咪除咗關注人嘅生活呢，都要關注其他植物、動物、真菌等等成個生態圈嘅情況。我哋只係關注我哋自己嘅生活，或者我哋只係關注我哋人類嘅生活嘅話，其實長遠嚟講，我哋嘅生活一定會好困難。最主要整今次嘅作品，嗰個起點係嗰個 life 嗰個字。咁 life 嗰個字到底係指人嘅生活，定係指萬物嘅生活？
今次嘅展覽係2018年泰國喀比雙年展同名作品嘅延續。當時創作靈感嚟自泰國北部一個提倡永續農耕嘅變革者 John 張大做過嘅一次 TED 講座，以 Life is easy, why do we make it so hard 為題，認為農耕生活已經足以令我哋自給自足，無需要喺城市營營役役。鄭波今次將句子反轉，製作成一個會生長嘅字母標語，以蘭花栽種喺由竹製嘅字母上面，設置喺嘉道理農場暨植物園入面嘅郭先生花園。大家行入花園嘅同時，可以邊行邊睇，就會揾到一共10個嘅藝術裝置。希望大家喺揾嘅過程，亦同時反思一下呢句句子嘅意思。
如果大家可以多啲時間慢慢行，其實就唔止係睇呢個作品，係可以講述下成個 garden 嘅環境。其實都可以聽到好多雀仔叫啊！如果好仔細嘅話，可以聞到唔同植物嘅味道，唔同時間又可以見到唔同嘅光線啊，可能會留意到唔同嘅花啊，係自然係一個好豐富嘅空間，俾自己嘅作品咧好多細節需要我哋去慢慢去講述。
其實要用植物嚟製作藝術作品，並唔係想像中咁簡單。植物生長需要有合適嘅土壤、水分、陽光等等嘅條件配合，所以鄭波聯同大嶼山村民以及嘉道理農場暨植物園嘅教育部緊密合作，並且喺佢哋嘅統籌下跨部門合作，研究適合呢個創作所使用嘅植物以及裝置方式。
一開始咧收到藝術發展局嘅呢一個計劃啦，咁所以我哋都需要同唔同嘅部門合作。咁今次我哋就同蘭花保育組咧一齊去傾點樣去揀一啲合適嘅蘭花，將佢咧裝喺竹棚上面。都同樹木管理隊咧一齊去合作啊！究竟用咩方法先至可以好安全咁樣將呢啲裝置咧擺喺樹木上面？所以今次咧，我哋其實係同唔同嘅部門咧一齊去合作咧，先至可以咧成功做到呢件事嘅。
我哋首先要考慮2個條件嘅，第一就係揾到適合嘅樹丫嘅時候，咁個樹丫個粗度能唔能夠承受到竹牌嘅重量呢？同埋嗰個吊掛嗰個角度會唔會令到個竹牌太過傾斜？另一樣嘢咧，喺嗰個適合嘅吊掛位置上面，仲有冇另一個樹丫能夠承受到我哋攀樹員嘅體重？若果符合晒呢2個條件嘅話咧，咁就可以嘗試去進行吊掛啦。
做好晒所有嘅安全嘅評估啊，然之後就去制定一啲工序。我哋首要做好地面有好多珍貴嘅植物，同埋周邊環境嘅保護啦。我哋係有啲好狹窄嘅位置去安裝。咁呢啲咧都會增加咗好多困難嘅。選用物料嘅時候咧，我哋都要好心思去考慮嘅。第一就係要環保啦，第二咧就係要可以重用，第三嗰個物料亦都唔可以太過大，因為大就會影響咗個樹牌嗰個觀感啦。第四又要佢個耐固性夠強。我哋所有選嘅料，就要貫徹翻我哋農場永續生活嗰個價值。
香港有超過100種蘭花喺度長。當然我哋今次用嘅蘭花就唔只係香港本地，其實係成個大嗰個 Indo-Burma region 嘅蘭花。因為我哋係想揀可以喺呢段時間可以開花嘅品種。因為今次嘅作品其實係將好多蘭花係種喺嗰個 竹架，嗰個竹架係掉咗喺空中，咁就唔係全部開花嘅植物都可以做得到。咁蘭花係其中一種可以喺樹上邊生存嘅。所以今次其實一定要同加道理嘅科學家 Stephen Gill， 佢先知道，比如呢個時間邊啲蘭花去開花，咁邊啲蘭花喺呢個地區嘅品種。如果冇咗佢嘅參與，成件事係一定做唔到。
Having talked with Zheng, that he's particularly interested in specialised ecological relationships, and orchids are a really good example of this. Orchids have 3 basic growing habits in the wild, as an example, and this is a kind of what we call terrestrial orchids. They grow with their roots in the soil on the ground. Another example is this really lovely little orchid, and we grow this in the nursery. We grow it like this on a piece of bark, and that's because in nature they grow on the bark of trees, and this we call an epiphytic orchid. And then the third group of orchids is something a bit like this, which grows on stone. Again, in the nursery we can replicate that kind of growing environment by planting the orchid directly on the stone, and this is called a lithophyte. Zheng was very interested to learn about the kinds of ways in which the orchids interact with their environment. The orchid flower is very typically very highly dependent on a kind of pollinator, and this particular orchid, for example, has a lovely aroma, a very nice fragrance. So the bee may be attracted to this flower and it will pick up the pollen and transfer it to another flower, and that will help the plant to be pollinated. There's another very interesting interaction which Bo was interested in, and that's the relationship with what are called mycorrhizal fungi. So the roots of orchids interact with fungi, whether they're in the soil or on the tree or on the stone. And the fungi help bring nutrients to the orchid plants, so there's a very important interaction there as well. This is the seeds of an orchid. And what's very unusual about the seeds of an orchid is that they're very, very tiny. Usually they're so small, they look like a speck of dust. And that allows them to be spread by the wind. Because the orchid seed is so small, they've actually removed, or they've done away with, the nutrient reserves which in any other seed would normally allow the seed to germinate and grow. And this is why orchids are so heavily dependent on fungi.
某啲蘭花嘅品種屬於附生植物，可以唔需要泥土，透過依附喺其他植物上吸收營養生長。鄭波就係利用咗呢種蘭花嘅特性，令蘭花所做嘅竹牌可以喺展覽期間健康生長。鄭波選用蘭花係受到佢喺泰國研究考察時所認識嘅蘭花專家所啟發。當地經常有人會去森林非法偷竊野生蘭花進行買賣，所以保育團體會繁殖蘭花，一半用嚟售賣換取營運資金，而另一半會被重植喺森林，用嚟填補被偷去嘅花位。喺香港，蘭花同樣面對相似嘅生存危機，因為蘭花除咗有觀賞價值，部分亦有中醫藥用途。由於需求不斷增加，令到某啲蘭花品種幾乎絕跡於野生環境。所以加道理農場暨植物園嘅專家亦致力研究蘭花保育工作。
Hong Kong is just a nice little microcosm of total orchid diversity. Situated here in the tropics, it's actually relatively rich here in Hong Kong. We have about 135 documented species in Hong Kong, which is really quite a large number given how small Hong Kong is. But then we also find a couple of more very specific threats which orchids face. And one of them is related to the very beautiful flowers that we all know orchids for. Orchids, unfortunately, are still collected illegally, in most cases, from the wild and sold and traded for people to grow at home. The other main problem, particularly here in China, is that certain orchids have a medicinal value, such as this one. This is a dendrobium. The stem of the dendrobium orchids is often collected and used to make a particular kind of traditional Chinese medicine, sekha. Because of that, and because of the increasing demands, particularly in mainland China, for these traditional medicines, many orchids are being harvested in huge numbers, not only in China itself, but also in neighbouring countries. So it's becoming increasingly rare to find, for example, dendrobiums and also slipper orchids in the wild. What we can do here and in places like Kaduri Farm is to provide those nutrients in a controlled environment in a similar way that the fungus would do in the wild. We use a mixture of both areas of study, both growing and studying orchids, to try and understand their ecology and to try and understand which species are rare and why. Our task is to try and protect the rarer species.
人類每一個行為都可以帶嚟嚴重嘅後果。一方面，有人會為咗生活便利，消耗好多地球資源；而另一方面，又有人會貢獻自己嘅知識、時間，致力拯救瀕危物種。到底我哋應該順應弱肉強食嘅自然規則，定係積極採取一啲行動？
我哋住喺地球上邊，我哋人其實係其中一個部分。當然，我哋而家嘅力量係一個好大嘅力量，但係始終我哋一定要同其他植物、動物、真菌啊、病毒啊、細菌啊，咁我哋一定要係同佢哋一齊維持嗰個平衡，我哋先可以生存落去。除咗諗我哋可以做乜嘅時候，就要諗係咪同自然一齊去合作。我哋喺其中一個力量，我哋就唔係可以主導嘅。我哋要好知道，我哋只不過係成個自然中嘅一部分。
I just think that we all need a bit more awareness and compassion and love for the place that we call home. Without that, I think humans are racing towards a cliff edge. So when it comes to orchids, I think people should consider where the plant that they're buying may have come from, if it's been collected from the wild, and because they want to grow something at home in their living room, it means that a habitat has been destroyed somewhere. Nothing comes from nowhere, everything has an origin. So I think it's all about connected thinking and understanding our place in the global ecology.
今次嘅展覽喺新冠肺炎爆發超過1年嘅時候進行，更加令人反思人類同埋自然之間出現咗咩問題。呢一個展覽另一部分展出嘅素描作品，都係鄭波喺經歷隔離前後所創作嘅。
跟住就展2組畫，上年開始就每日畫一張。咁呢一組咧就喺12月喺多國翻嚟嘅時候喺酒店隔離，咁我就帶咗一棵細棵嘅蕨，咁就入咗去隔離，咁就每日都係畫一張，每日個角度可能有少少唔同，但係我仔細睇就會見到個植物係一路長緊嘅。咁另外一組就喺隔離完之後翻咗去大嶼山，就每日出去行嘅時候咧，咁想坐低一陣，咁就坐低畫下身邊嘅植物。有時咧，比如我都覺得好普通嘅嘢，咁但係坐定畫嘅時候咧，先見到原來佢係好多細緻啊，佢開花啊、結果都係好特別。我覺得全部喺地球生存嘅生命，只係我哋用心去睇佢哋，都會覺得佢哋好靚。今次展覽呢個時間其實好特別，因為喺個疫情中間做咗呢個作品，其實係之前未諗到。好多人都已經講過，我哋而家呢個疫情嘅原因係因為我哋同自然嘅關係被破壞咗。全部地球啲萬物都係有關係，只不過個關係咧，我哋平時可能睇唔清楚嗰個關係喺邊。咁我覺得而家需要其實要諗清楚，我哋有啲咩嘢係唔可以做嘅。我哋要填海。我哋要改變呢個地方嘅時候咧，其實我哋要特別謹慎做呢件事，因為可能而家覺得冇乜嘢發生，但過咗一段時間先去知道，哦，原來係一個好大嘅問題。
鄭波喺思考創作嘅過程中，養成每日行山嘅習慣，幫助佢思考同埋反思身邊嘅生態環境。體會到人類其實只係整個生物鏈中嘅一小部分，但好多時人類都會將自己擺喺一個高高在上嘅位置，只會考慮人同人之間嘅合作，忘記人類同埋自然都應該互相合作，先可以平衡發展。
我哋坐喺呢度咧，其實都會望到全部都係植物嘅。 所以如果自己身邊住咗咁多嘅生命，自己都唔知佢哋到底係點生存，其實自己係一個好無知嘅狀態。其實香港係一個好多 plants 嘅地方，因為我哋住喺南方，天氣又好，山上邊啊或者周圍公園入邊，其實係長緊好多唔同嘅 plants。我覺得今次最重要就係可以令到觀眾可以諗多少少我哋人之外嘅生命嘅狀況，可以每日多少少時間可以同 plant 一齊講述下佢哋嘅健康啊，一年四季嘅變化。我覺得一定會令到我哋自己生活都會開心嘅。